Hello, everyone. You're in the Ether, and I'm your host, Cody Fry. Welcome back for Season 1, Episode 10. So good to have you, and it's great to be back. The Ether is now officially coming to you from the Emerald City of the Western Cascades, Eugene, Oregon. I want to thank our returning audience. Appreciate you guys. Thanks for sticking it out over the break, and welcome any newcomers to the show as well. Really means a lot to have you all here, and as promised, guys, after the big move, after a few trials in the new studio, nothing that couldn't be overcome, I'm happy to report the Ether is back, although technically it never really left, but as most of you know, I had to kind of take a break myself so I could make this whole insane move across the country. It was kind of a big deal, so thank you for your patience and your understanding on that. In fact, the last we spoke, I was just about to embark on this whole crazy journey I've been on for the past several months. So it's a little surreal, but it feels good to be on the other side of this whole thing because a lot of work went into it. A lot of risks were taken. And the fact that things just kind of worked out the way they did, it's pretty great. And I'm grateful. I feel better off for it. And I know the show is going to be as well. I can't imagine a more perfect home for the Ether going forward. We will talk more about that in due time, of course, but I've got a great show for you today. I've been looking forward to this one for a while, obviously. So to mark this new chapter, we're just going to dedicate episode 10 entirely to Oregon, mostly because I just moved here, yes, but make no mistake, Oregon is intense. It's vibrant. It is dramatic. And for lack of a better term, it's oftentimes kind of creepy. It's just something you feel and you see it, and you just kind of have to be there. And I figured it's about time I take a closer look at it and shared some of it with you guys. And I'm beyond thrilled that I can do at least some of that now with a little bit of firsthand experience. So pretty excited about that. But as part of my ongoing quest to learn more about some of the bizarre history here, I picked up the book Haunted Oregon. It's by journalist Andy Weeks. I believe the Kindle version came out in 2016, so not a brand new bestseller or anything like that. It's one of those books you randomly kind of take a chance on that ends up having a bunch of information. There's about 100 stories in here, give or take. So yeah, a lot to choose from and a pretty intriguing mix as well. And I tried to represent some of the better ones, of course. Highly entertaining book. That's all coming up here very soon. But seeing as how it's kind of been forever since I talked to you, I feel like I should get you caught up on the show a little. Just real quickly speak about where it's at and where it's going. So first and foremost, you can expect new episodes of The Ether now going forward on what I hope to be a regular basis. I know that may sound a little vague, but bear with me. The frequency will improve over time. Right now, schedules and other things just haven't quite optimized, to free up the time it takes to produce the show, at least as often as I'd like to. But again, I do expect that to change over time. Right now, I'm just really excited to be in Eugene, and I can't wait to see how this place affects this show. Nature here in general in the Pacific Northwest is just breathtaking. It's surreal. It's almost haunting or mystical, probably both. Very Twin Peaks-esque. And fun fact, most of that show was filmed less than 5 hours north of Eugene. So not just making a lame comparison here, you can rely on that mental image because it's pretty accurate. It definitely makes even some of the most mundane activities a little more interesting, I'll put it that way. So you can understand my contentment with the Ether's new base of operations. It is ideal. And I certainly do plan to reach out to some of the local natives here at some point in the future and feature their experiences. I mean, I'd be a fool not to. This isn't just Bigfoot country. As evident by this book, the stories I've researched and heard about in the past, Oregon is home to much more, from sea creatures and lake monsters, ghost ships, ghost pirates, dogmen and or werewolves, shadow beings, UFOs, orbs, and other bizarre activity in the skies, weird disappearances, alleged curses, tons of hauntings and paranormal activity in general. And no, in case you're wondering, that's not why I moved here. I had other motives that may or may not have been indirectly tied to that, but regardless, I feel like the Ether has just leveled up significantly in terms of mystique and overall weirdness just by being here. So I plan to fully take advantage of that, and you guys will be the ones that benefit the most from it. So very exciting. That said, I just want to thank everyone who's left feedback, commented somewhere, left a review or rating on iTunes or elsewhere. It is great to hear from you all. I love to get your thoughts on the show. Just wanted to acknowledge you guys for taking that time. You know who you are. It really impacts the show in some positive ways, because without your feedback, it's kind of tough to gauge how we're doing, In other words, whatever you give gets funneled directly back into this program. So I welcome and encourage anyone who hasn't already shared, reviewed, rated, or commented on the show. If there's a story you've been meaning to share, if you haven't started following us on Facebook or Instagram, please do. It's important for me to be able to produce and share this content with you guys, as often as I can. Something I'm pretty passionate about, and you all are a huge part of that just for listening, and thank you for that. So here's to the next chapter, to the future of the ether, and to the strange and beautiful Pacific Northwest. When we come back, we're going to get into some stories from the book Haunted Oregon by Andy Weeks. Don't go anywhere, guys. Let's begin with the Portland Underground, aka the Shanghai Tunnels, which are reportedly this intricate system of tunnels located underneath mostly the Chinatown area and into downtown Portland. It is said that at one point these tunnels, they connected all these various establishments, mostly hotel and bar basements, to one another and to the Willamette River docks. From circa late 1800s to about the 1940s, they used these tunnels to deliver goods from the ships directly to these places. They avoided all the train and streetcar traffic above ground doing that. But they got their name Shanghai Tunnels from the lore of men routinely being drugged or knocked unconscious, kidnapped, and being whisked away through these tunnels to be sold or traded to ship captains who were traveling along the river, desperately searching for crewmen. It said some of these unfortunate guys would wake up hours later, the ship had already left port, and it would take some of them years to return back to Portland if they ever even managed to. So kind of sad, but allegedly, many of them never even made it onto the ship. They were left for dead in the tunnels. Whether they refused to go, tried to escape, it's not really clear. There's not a lot of really solid information on this out there. But men were kidnapped, sold, traded, killed in Portland. That's pretty widely accepted as true. But whether this stuff occurred in the, quote, Portland Underground, that's kind of up for debate. The mainstream consensus is there's no evidence for it. And that appears to be true. I mean, if you look, there's not a whole lot to go on, just stories passed down from unknown origins. So it's a reasonable argument. But the tunnels were home to prostitution, organized crime, gambling, all kinds of hijinks during the Prohibition era. That much most people agree on. There's various evidence to support it. And in all fairness, the tunnels really are shrouded in quite a bit of mystery. There are no city plans, blueprints, maps, anything on the development of them, which is kind of odd considering the effort it must have taken. Yet they definitely do exist, but no official record or explanation when or why they were shut down or by whom exists. But you can still see some of these old basement entrances downtown, which were boarded up and closed off roughly 70 years ago. So if crime routinely did take place in the Portland Underground, Are human trafficking and murder that big of a stretch? Now, stories of apparitions and other paranormal activity are quite common in downtown Portland. Many business owners and staff have reported strange experiences over the years, and it is theorized, of course, that spirits who perhaps died in the Shanghai tunnels or had some other kind of connection to them still dwell below or above ground today. Commonly reported are things like ghostly prostitutes attempting to lure men into the depths of basements, figures of other men and women in period era clothing, many times what appear to be sailors, unseen hands grabbing people, objects disappearing and showing up later in weird places. There's a story of Mike, who owns an antique shop downtown. One day he's just minding the store when this very large metal pole quite randomly fell off the wall and it hit him in the head. Thankfully, he wasn't badly injured or anything. There was actually a family in the store who witnessed this and rushed over to make sure he was okay. And he was mostly just startled. But as Mike inspected this thing, he wasn't able to figure out how it could have fallen. Nothing holding it up had broken or come loose. Nothing flew over or drove past that could have caused it to vibrate off the wall. It's one of those things where you could say, okay, something fell off the wall. That does happen. But when you start eliminating every conceivable possibility why, your mind does kind of tend to wander a little bit. And Mike, he was really taken aback by this whole experience. He began to think about items he'd sell being returned to the shop only to be sold and returned again by the next customer and the next. And they all reported the same type of things, that it disturbed them. They felt very strongly that it didn't belong in their homes, like the item or whoever or whatever is attached to the item just wasn't having it. And Mike, he's starting to, connect some dots. And one night, two men walking past his shop, they see something move past the window. So they move in for a closer look, and they see a figure of a woman floating across the store about 9 feet above the ground. Meanwhile, Mike's mother-in-law, she too ran a local business in the Saturday Market District, and she had found a photograph in the upstairs room of her shop. And it was of a woman in early 20th century clothing wearing a bonnet. Not much else is said. I don't know about the age or anything, but she felt really compelled for whatever reason that this photograph belonged in Mike's store, like she had to take it there. So she does. And Mike displays it in the store. And sure enough, the two men that had seen that apparition that night, they are frequent visitors. So they come in and they see the photo, and they're both 100% sure that's the woman they saw floating through Mike's shop that night. And there's a wealth of other paranormal accounts in downtown Portland that we can't get to for the sake of time. Some similar, others not so much. But I was never aware of the Portland Underground until I read this book and dug into it a little bit. So found it really intriguing. Mike's story on its own doesn't really rock the paranormal world. It's a pretty common tale, but when you consider the possibility that some of these entities might be connected to this whole seedy underworld, it's pretty fascinating. And on a personal note, I actually recently did make it up to Portland. It was a really quick visit, though, and I was across the river from the Saturday Market District, so I didn't have a chance to really investigate any of this stuff, unfortunately. But I have heard about some local tours there that claim to take you to see some of these old boarded up entrances to the tunnels. They go over the history and such. Wasn't that kind of visit, maybe next time. But we did manage to find ourselves in one of the strangest shops I've ever patronized. So if you do get a chance, make sure you visit a place called Really Good Stuff. And yes, that is the name, and I'm going to leave it at that. This next story is about the Balk family and a man named Mortimer Stump. Now, Danford Balk, he marries his wife, Mary Jane, in around 1842. Sometime between 1847 and 1850, depending on the source, they left Iowa, crossed the plains via the Oregon Trail with their 9 kids, and they settled on a remote claim of land in northwest Portland. Neighborhood today known as Northwest Heights in Forest Park. Actually pretty nice neighborhood today. The real estate in that area is some of the most valuable in all of Portland. The Balks were pretty much the first to settle in that area, and as more people eventually settled in, Danford had become sort of a man of the town. I'm not sure about his occupation. I'm guessing farmer, but there's nothing anywhere about this, so I know they had a farm. We're just going to go with that. It's 1858. The Balks had recently taken on some live-in hired help, a young man from the east side of the Willamette River named Mortimer Stump. While staying there, he becomes intimately involved with their eldest daughter, 15-year-old Anna. Now, I wasn't able to determine Mortimer's age. I don't think anybody knows. He's referred to as a young man. I don't know if that means 17 or 25, but I think by all accounts, he was older than Anna. I just don't know by how much. I should say, too, by this point, Danford had begun drinking pretty heavily in the years leading up to and during this time. Eventually, Mortimer asks her father, Danford, for his permission to marry her, and Danford's just disgusted by the idea. Like, There's no way in hell this clown from the wrong side of the river is going to marry his daughter. Stump is fired. He's thrown out of their home immediately, told never to return. Of course, Anna and Mortimer, they rebel. They flee to Vancouver, Washington, and elope. Apparently, marriages in Vancouver in that era were kind of like marriages today in Vegas. No waiting lists, less regulations and such. You're just kind of married on the spot and done deal. Now, Danford's devastated by this. He's furious. Something to note, too, Mary Jane had 2 kids before she met Danford, and it's believed Anna was actually his stepdaughter. And questions arose over time about just what kind of relationship Danford and Anna had based on how he reacted and some of the things that he said. It's cited enough times in the resources I looked at that I thought it was definitely worth mentioning. And we're going to kind of come back to that in just a bit as well. But it's November 8th, and Danford's drinking at a local saloon when he spots the newlyweds come into town for supplies. A confrontation ensues between Mortimer and Danford. Threats are made, words are exchanged, but that's about as far as it goes for the time being. Anna and Mortimer then board the Stark Street ferry. And just a side note here, because I find this detail pretty amusing, this was a boat powered by ferrymen throwing rocks at an actual mule on a treadmill that drove a paddle wheel. So say what you will about modern times and the troubles we currently face, but at least we're past that, right? But Danford, meanwhile, he goes home, pours himself another big drink, and grabs his double-barrel shotgun. Moments later, he finds them, and Danford shoots Mortimer Stump point blank in the face on the deck of the ferry, and he dies. Mr. Balk is accosted by onlookers. He's placed in some kind of makeshift wooden jail, but manages to make a break for it, but he's later captured and officially becomes Oregon's first person to ever be publicly executed, and he is hanged October 18th, 1859. But back to Anna, just regarding whatever kind of relationship she had with Danford, she attended the execution, determined to see him die. She shed no tears. It was kind of that sort of thing. And there was a local reporter there for the Portland Oregonian who had later gone on record saying how, distasteful it was for her to be there, just made this really big fuss about it. And it doesn't answer any questions as to their relationship, but it does add another interesting wrinkle to it. And during his trial, Danford made some pretty curious statements as well. He went on record claiming that he wasn't acting under his own volition, that he feared his wife was a witch and that she had cursed him, and that she would often encourage him to kill Mortimer with that shotgun. Pretty tough to say whether there's any truth to those claims, but a couple of things should definitely be noted. He was an alcoholic, obviously. He was pretty inebriated at the time. That had a lot to do with it, surely. But Mary Jane was also a widow. Nobody knows what happened to her first husband. So, yeah, we shouldn't speculate too much, but there's enough there to, I think we can afford to speculate a little bit. After his death, Mary Jane then continued to live on the family's property in the cabin for some time. As best I can tell, she passed away in 1875, and that land eventually became the property of the city of Portland in 1897. And around 1950, I believe, a small ranger station and a rest area were built not far from the old Balk cabin. And ironically, all that's left of that today is the stone ruins of what was once that rest area. And it just so happens to be shaped almost like a perfect little castle. So, of course, it eventually picked up the name Witch's Castle. But reportedly, there have been many sightings of strange orbs and other kinds of lights, as well as shadow-type figures, all within the confines of the old Balk property, including Witch's Castle. Something that's actually reported quite a lot are people appearing out of nowhere, dressed in battle gear, apparently fighting some kind of war. Also, many people claim to have seen the spirits of Danford, Anna, Mary Jane, and Mortimer fighting or arguing amongst each other. Now, this is one of those stories where I could definitely imagine parts of it being true while others are maybe embellished or just false, but I think it's the story that got me. It's almost like a Romeo and Juliet kind of tragedy, one with a kind of a few dark and weird undertones, but it's also reminiscent of a lot of stories I've seen about these highly charged events, that were etched into our time space and just keep replaying themselves, or, souls not being able to cross over because of unresolved issues, stuff like that. So was Mary Jane a witch who controlled and ultimately destroyed her husbands? I don't know. Considering what she would have had to gain by Mortimer's death or her husband's demise, it's hard to say, because there really isn't much to go on, so you kind of have to draw your own conclusions there. So was this whole thing merely a combination of an unhinged guy with some obvious anger management problems and alcoholic tendencies? Yeah, maybe. In all fairness, though, we really don't know either way. But I'd at least like to add, though, I did get the opportunity to see Witch's Castle on that recent visit to Portland, and I've got to say that whole area is just remarkable. It's beautiful. If you ever get the chance, I highly recommend it. Didn't experience anything out of the ordinary, nor was I expecting to. Unless you count the one guy, I guess he actually was in battle gear. That much I assure you, but he was very modern and very real. I believe he said he was there dressed as a character from the game Dark Souls. So, strange, depending who you ask, maybe, but definitely not paranormal, right? But the area around Witch's Castle, though, it felt strange to me, and I could have been picking up on a vibe, or maybe it was just my own imagination, but something about it did feel off, and I'm a little intrigued if I'm being honest. So if I'm feeling adventurous enough one day, I might just head back out there kind of after hours, see what's up then, but no promises. That's on my list of maybes. So when we come back after the break, we're going to dive deeper into this enigmatic place as we travel across different regions of Oregon and encounter the bizarre. And it only gets weirder from here. Stay with me. Let's head up the coast toward the northwest corner of Oregon. Now, situated between Cannon Beach and Seaside, about a mile offshore, stands Tillamook Rock Lighthouse. In the year 1880, as this thing was actually under construction, it wasn't functional yet, but there was a really severe storm that came in and just destroyed and overturned several fishing boats. It ended up killing about 25 people. So sounds largely unexpected and pretty severe. But it was believed then by Native Americans in that area that their gods had cursed this land and that evil spirits who resided along the jagged rocks and the cliff sides near Cannon Beach were the ones actually responsible for this. During the storm, multiple witnesses reported what they thought was a ghost ship that appeared to be picking up souls of the dead, and apparently this same ship was again seen later in the 1950s by the Coast Guard. They reported that it broke through the dense fog just below the lighthouse and then just as quickly vanished into thin air. This is interesting because I'm not sure how they managed to identify that as the same ship, but that's not mentioned. I did dig into this a little bit further though. I found a James A. Gibb who spent a year on the Rock. He wrote a book on West Coast lighthouses. And he went on record insisting this place is haunted, that all four lighthouse keepers on shift one night, they saw the same ghost ship, that he would often hear low whispering moans that seemed to emanate from the stairwell leading up to the lantern. And this is also pretty consistent with other people's reports. It is said another man was actually chased up the stairs by a ghost. He apparently pushed it back down the stairs in his scramble to get away from the thing, and he left the place in a straitjacket, and it's believed his ghost now haunts the lighthouse as well. And they officially closed it in 1957. Some private investors stepped up and bought the place for a time to house, of all things, urns, but it was abandoned in 1999. And as it sits now, I've got to say, it really looks like the kind of place you would not want to be. It's a really desolate, creepy, intimidating looking place out in the middle of some really harsh natural elements. So even if I had the opportunity, I'm quite certain I would pass. And Tillamook Rock is just one of many allegedly haunted lighthouses in Oregon, like Heceta Head north of Florence, a little further down the coast a bit. That's one I've actually seen for myself. It's gorgeous. I believe the most photographed lighthouse in the world. Fun fact. There's also the Yaquina Head and Yaquina Bay lighthouses in Newport, as well as several more that dot the Pacific, and each one of them has a really unique past, and there's books written on this very subject. So if that's something you're into, there's definitely some literature out there on it. Let's revisit Cannon Beach for a moment now. In terms of early Native Americans believing that spirits dwelled there, I tried to validate this online a little bit, but I couldn't find more than just a few vague references to it, and I had to move on for the sake of other content. But there is a weird history here nonetheless. So Cannon Beach, Oregon is definitely best known for its scenic beach, revered haystack rock. It's an intensely beautiful place. It's been featured in film, art, literature, etc. for many years. But it's also home to a legend of another kind, and he goes by the name Bandage Man. Now, the book doesn't go into much depth here, nor does it with most of the content, but that's intentional. High content, fairly short on detail, and that's okay because it doesn't try to be more than that. And I actually think that encourages readers who want to know more to do their own research, and that is always a good thing. But back to Bandage Man, he appears to emerge in the 1960s with a story we've all heard before. I think it's pretty familiar by now. A young couple parked alone at an overlook near Cannon Beach. They're having a little more than polite conversation, right? When they feel the back of their truck start shaking, and they turn around and witness what appears to be a man wrapped in blood-stained bandages. He's latched onto the back of the truck, and he's just staring at them ominously. He starts pounding his fists against the back of the truck and on the window. Terrified, they flee, of course, with the Bandage Man still hanging on, still pounding on the truck. And a few miles later, they stop, and he's just gone. No trace of him. And this one's almost too easy, to write off as yet another urban yarn spun by concerned parents to keep their hormonal teens in line. And that's actually a really interesting theory that we're going to come back to. But this wasn't just some one-off event. Apparently, people have been reporting seeing a strange figure of a man at least, in bandages in the Cannon Beach area ever since. Sightings typically occur on a stretch of Highway 101, which runs along the coast, and on a short approach road that connects 101 to the beach, which locals lovingly refer to, of course, as Bandage Man Road. He's said to smell of rotten flesh. Sometimes people report one of his limbs will jut out at a bizarre angle. He's spotted on the side of the highway at times, but he's also notorious for approaching or latching onto slow-moving or stationary vehicles, usually trucks or open-roofed cars. In these cases, he'll pound on the vehicles, he'll try to attack drivers, sometimes even physically breaking glass to do so. He'll often hang on to or stay inside the vehicle until it just about reaches the town of Cannon Beach, and he'll simply disappear. He will reportedly sometimes even leave behind pieces of his bandages that carry that foul odor. He allegedly kills and eats local wildlife. Others claim he's actually murdered several humans, though it's doubtful anything resembling evidence exists to support that. But as far as his origin, most claim he was a local logger who died in a gruesome sawmill accident, so you'll have to use your imagination there. Other theories vary from being a criminal who was transported somewhere, the vehicle crashed and he fled the scene, to some other malevolent force, possibly not of this earth. There are other more prosaic possible explanations, of course, and the prankster theory is valid. I'm not entirely convinced, though. I mean, that would have to be a pretty brazen prankster to jump into or inside of a passing or parked vehicle to try to assault the driver and break their windows and hang onto their car. That's kind of next level stuff. It almost sounds more to me like somebody suffering from mental problems than some idiot's idea of a joke. And what about the odor, or that he always vanishes from sight in the same location? Is it one person, or have there been others? Is it the spirit of some unfortunate vengeful logger? Is it even a spirit at all? What if he never actually existed? What if Bandage Man is something else entirely? An entity that somebody manifested, a tulpa. Slender Man comes to mind. I'm sure most of you are probably familiar with that disturbing phenomenon. But that opens up another world of questions we could spend the next hour pondering, but I'd at least like to pause long enough to ponder one of those. If so-called thought forms are real, if people can really manifest living metaphysical beings that can interact with us and affect our reality, if humans have such an extraordinary ability, what's not on the table? What isn't fair game? You could take that logic all the way to the abyss and theorize that humans create the very universe we exist in, but that's perhaps a rabbit hole for another time. Let's travel to South Central Oregon now to visit one of the most popular attractions in the state. Not to mention one of the most surreal places on Earth. Northeast of Medford, about 100 miles, stands Crater Lake. And this place has been featured in a story or two previously, so it's no stranger to crazy. But a quick history, it was formed 8,000 years ago when Mount Mazama exploded and collapsed. It formed a caldera, and rainwater eventually filled this, making it Crater Lake. And it's the deepest lake in the country at 2,000 feet, and it's 20 square miles across. It sits over 6,000 feet above sea level. And technical stuff aside, this place is immense. It's mesmerizing. It's been revered and feared by man for centuries. If you've never seen it before, I suggest you look it up real quick. It's just the color of the water alone is kind of enough to send chills down my spine. I'm not sure what it is, but it's apparently not just home to tourists and local visitors either. Tales of odd creatures and phantoms in and around the lake, strange disappearances, UFOs, and bizarre lights, and paranormal activity abound and have for many years. Early Native American tribes regarded it as an unhappy place, home to dark spirits, and they went out of their way to avoid it. Many who did go there, it's said they never returned. The book mentions not one but two Sasquatch were allegedly killed in the park, one by a train that was never officially reported, the other by a car that government agents supposedly hauled away. No further details on that, but it does talk a little bit about the early Klamath tribe of Native Americans who believed their great spirit above collapsed the volcano to bury and trap the evil spirit below, who sometimes takes the form of a giant crayfish-like creature that reaches up from the lake and snatches people from the rim of the crater. Now, I'm inclined to think that a lot of this stuff does sound like it probably has more to do with fear and elaborate dramatic storytelling than actual fact, but as we all know, there's usually a kernel of truth to stuff like this, and I believe that's the case here too, as evident by the volume of weird sightings, including Bigfoot, creatures emerging from or diving into the lake that best resemble dragons or dinosaurs, odd crafts and bizarre lights that dart in and out of the water, strange disappearances, and the list kind of goes on. And this is where the book stops, and I wanted to include at least a little bit more detail for you. So I went digging, and I was able to find a ranger in the park that has reported several times that she and her colleagues, they'll see a campfire burning, they'll go to investigate it, and it's suddenly gone. No signs of any fire. She once saw a large gathering of people standing around a campfire one night, and it all vanished completely once she got close enough to confront them, again, leaving no trace that the ground was even so much as disturbed. A woman in 1947 said that her husband appeared to be in some kind of a trance as he handed her his wallet and casually walked off a cliff. He broke his leg and then proceeded to throw himself even farther down into the water where he drowned. Another legend names Wizard Island, which is a volcanic cinder cone inside the lake, as a place where souls of the damned live on in the forms of winged salamanders. That's different. And I could keep going with Crater Lake. There doesn't appear to be any shortage of strange tales or weird phenomena. But alas, I got to move on here because there's just so many more stories and locations in this book. That said, let's move onward then to our final location. And this is in far northeast Oregon, east of the Blue Mountains range, and resting in the Wallowa Mountains at an elevation of over 4,300 feet lies Wallowa Lake. It is a 6-mile-long ribbon lake that was carved and filled by glaciers during the Ice Age, and its main claim to paranormal fame is the Wallowa Lake Monster, also known as Wally. One of the earlier sightings of Wally comes from 1885. A local prospector out midway across the lake, he reported the creature reared its huge flat-shaped head and 10-foot-long neck off to his right about 50 feet away. It then submerged for a moment and reappeared on his left side about the same distance away, and then it just dove back down into the water and he didn't see it again. But sightings continue into modern times, and later reports appear to describe a creature elongated, possibly up to 100 feet in length, not unlike Nessie. However, earlier reports describe the monster as having horns on its head and many bumps on its back, kind of like a Chinese dragon. And there's a really early story about a warrior from the Nez Perce tribe who, while venturing into the high mountains one day, suddenly stumbled upon the creature. Startled, it quickly moved down the mountain and plunged into the water. The young warrior pursues this thing into the water, surely expecting, high praise and honor for killing such a creature or capturing it. But it's almost like this thing is playing a game with him. Every time he thinks he's close enough, it just submerges and reappears elsewhere. And this goes on and on. So he finally gives up. Defeated, he doesn't take more than a couple of steps on shore when he feels something tug at his legs. And fellow members of his tribe are apparently on shore to witness this as well when the creature suddenly pulls him into the lake he's never seen again. It seems, though, crafty old Wally is not the only strange inhabitant of this area. It's believed one or more likely several Sasquatch also roam the scenic woods nearby. One of the earlier reports is from 1970 when a gentleman pulled his camper over to the side of Wallowa Lake Road to get some rest, and he woke up to heavy running and grunting and screaming outside of his camper. And whatever this thing was seemed to be trying to scare him because it started shaking his camper back and forth. Finally, it ran off. But a little shaken by this, he told a gas station attendant nearby after this happened. And I find this part amusing because the guy just flatly replied, yeah, he's been doing that to people. He's kind of cranky. And just to mention a couple more sightings here, two of them are seen walking upright together in '88 by a teenager who's out scouting for elk. A group of campers about the same time, maybe the following year, report one rummaging through their backpacks at their campsite. And later in 2000, a hunter observes another in a valley close to the nearby city of Joseph. In 2007, a logging trucker driving between Elgin and Joseph on his way to pick up a load at about 5:30 a.m. He pulls off to the side of the road to relieve himself. He's pretty much just drank an entire pot of coffee, and he's certain there's absolutely nobody around for miles upon miles when he suddenly gets the uncomfortable feeling he's being watched. And just to describe the area real quickly here, it's remote. Backlogging roads amid thousands of acres of untouched forest and mountains. So yeah, definitely no man's land. So facing the forest, his back to the open door of his truck, about 3 to 4 car lengths away, directly in front of him stands what he calls the most massive and unnatural thing he's ever seen. In complete and utter shock and disbelief, the hair on his body standing on end, he cuts his visit short and slowly backs up into his truck. Once inside, the cabbie locks his doors and he grabs his pistol and his camera, unsure which one he's going to use. And after a moment or so, he's not really feeling threatened by this thing. So he picks up his camera, he takes a photo, puts it back down, and he just continues to stare at this thing in amazement for about the next minute before it turns to leave. So he quickly grabs his camera, takes another, one last side shot of its face before it calmly walks back into the woods, never looks back, and just eventually disappears into the landscape. Now, the million-dollar question, right, is where are these pictures? Well, the story didn't come from the book. I found it on BigfootEncounters.com. It was submitted by Stacy Wright in 2012, this man's daughter. And she goes on to share some details about how they grew up on a wheat farm in Washington, how her dad was always a really serious, hardworking, nose to the grindstone type who was actually a Bigfoot skeptic prior to this experience. Now, this all apparently originated from a conversation she was having with her dad. They were sitting in his truck one day in the summer of 2007, and he turned and asked her, "Are you a believer in unnatural things?" And apparently not too convinced by her reply, he kind of drops it, and she has to ask him several times, and he finally hands her his digital camera. Stacy kind of scoffs at it and says something like, what TV show did you get this from? And he's hurt by that. He takes his camera back and gives her the silent treatment for the next hour and finally says, I thought you of all people would understand. So, he's making this really sincere statement now after reluctantly sharing this with her, and she feels bad by this point. She gets it. Oh shit, this isn't a joke. And he goes on to tell her, look, I know what people are going to think. That's why I don't share my story. That's why I don't show anybody these pictures. I had a coworker who made that mistake. He reported his similar sighting about a half a year later. He lost his job, and not to mention all his family and friends have written him off as crazy. Now, Stacy claims that she's honoring her father's wishes these photos not be shared, thus why they're not available. And yeah, that does kind of sound like a handy excuse, right? But it also could be true. The more I think about it, the more I don't really know what a person like that would have to gain by fabricating and posting a story like that to a Bigfoot website. I'm sure some might and probably do, but we shouldn't jump to either conclusion in this case. She goes on to give a pretty detailed description of this thing, 7 to 8 feet tall, 300 pounds at least, very dark skin color similar to a gorilla, very well-defined, extremely muscular build, tight-lipped and stern-looking arms at its side but not touching its body, large sloping forehead, small ears and nose, eyes dark and deeply set with a scar running from his brow to his bottom lip. His hair begins halfway back like a receding hairline, but natural. It's significantly thicker than human hair, long and reddish brown, dreadlocked, and covers most of its body except its face and neck. And Stacy adds that he's actually not appalling or scary to look at, more like he's almost kind of handsome for something of this nature, like a warrior or a hunter. Again, so this last one isn't from the book, but I thought it was relevant, and I wanted to share it because obviously it happened so close to Wallowa Lake, and I like the story. I don't know if it's true, but it does have an air of sincerity, I think, And if he really did see something that day, it's anybody's guess who or what, but the profound impact that sighting had on him and his daughter, that's huge. We really can't gloss over that. We could speculate all day long whether that was Bigfoot, a bear, or something else, but these two people's lives were changed forever after seeing whatever the hell's in those two pictures. So that's something to really consider when you think about what he may have encountered that day. And there's a ton of others that I wish I could have dove into today, but I had to release episode 10 at some point. But if you want to read up a little bit more on Oregon's weirder side, the book's called Haunted Oregon, Ghosts and Strange Phenomena of the Beaver State. It is by Andy Weeks, and it's available on Amazon. Again, it won't blow you away with details, but it's a really fun read, and there's more than enough in here for any amateur researcher to really dig into, especially if you have a taste for the Pacific Northwest. So it has definitely made my transition to Oregon that much more entertaining. I'll be back after the final break to wrap this one up with some closing thoughts. Stay with me, guys. So again, I had a great time going through this book, learning a little bit more about my new surroundings. I know my list of places to see has definitely grown since I've been reading this book, and that's awesome. I'm left with way more questions than answers, but that's kind of par for the course. And at least I have a little better idea of what kind of things to look out for as I travel about. I plan to visit Cannon Beach and Crater Lake. I've been looking forward to that, both places, for many years. But after looking at Wallowa Lake, I've got to say that place went from complete unknown for me to absolute must-see. It looks incredible. And yeah, obviously we focused on Oregon today, but there are some broader themes to recognize. We touched on thought forms, creatures that shouldn't exist but get reported anyway, various paranormal activity. As you may have noticed, we didn't get into a lot of UFO or UAP stuff today. And the book doesn't really have a lot on that, to be honest. There's a few orb stories, but usually people like this author kind of tend to label those as spirits. And I don't know. I just don't like to jump to that conclusion myself. I think a lot of people use the term spirit or haunting way too much as, labels that they just throw at things to see if they stick. And I want to try to avoid that. But having said that, there's not much of an overarching theme, for today's episode, aside from the fact that all this weird stuff apparently happened in Oregon. But safe to say, unexplained phenomena probably happens everywhere, whether we're aware of it or not. The point for today, I suppose, though, is that every place has a certain flavor, and Oregon is definitely no exception. But I've asked this before, I gotta wonder how much location does really play into some of this. I mean, we know that Bigfoot, for example, is usually reported a lot more in the Pacific Northwest than most other places. What about the other stuff, though? How is a physical location as we know it relevant to a spirit? And I really struggle with this one because I can't help but imagine that when we die, we pass through or into some ethereal place or dimension, and I can't reconcile why we'd choose to come back and stay here after the fact. Is emotional attachment really that powerful that somebody or something would keep us here? Again, is there a choice, or is that already made for you? Are these supposed spirits even tangible in any way? Are they just imprints left in our time space? I'd say the ones that can interact with us definitely seem tangible enough to me, but what does that tell us about the others that seemingly go on about their business unaware of our presence? And on that note, I would like to pose one final question here for you. What if everything that we think we understand, everything we think we know about these phenomena isn't even close? None of the above. And that is where I'm going to conclude episode 10. I want to thank you guys for joining me. Such a pleasure to finally have you back once more, and I hope you enjoyed today's episode. And thanks again, by the way, for your patience over the break. Much appreciated. Stay tuned for updates on new episodes via Facebook and Instagram. And if you already haven't, please subscribe on iTunes and follow us on YouTube and Spotify. Thanks again for joining me in the ether. We'll see you next time.